Over the last 2 weeks, I have had the very, very meaningful experience of having the opportunity to read The Spiral Staircase, My Climb Out of Darkness. And just to show you how on the front wave of things we are, this book was given to me as a pre-publication date because the book was only published this past Tuesday. So we are here in this very lovely occasion to inaugurate this book with Karen Armstrong and the Knopf Company. And so it's a very special privilege for us. Most of you, I know, over the past decade have read several of Karen Armstrong's studies on Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, in which she is seeking to enlighten us on a multi-faith dialogue and perspective and demonstrating that we are all seeking the same God. We have these books in the other room, and you'll have the opportunity to purchase them and to purchase The Spiral Staircase, which Karen will autograph for you afterwards. The History of God, biographies of Muhammad and Buddha, Jerusalem, One City and Three Faiths. I'm not going on because she has now written 15 books, and you'll have a chance to browse on them, I think. Tonight, she's going to share with us a more personal spiritual journey, which interweaves her own story with the story of her interfaith journey that she has made. And I want to read to you from the final paragraph of this wonderful new book of hers. She says, I picture a narrow spiral staircase. I tried to get off of it and join others on what seemed to me to be a broad, noble flight of steps, thronged with people. But I kept falling off. And when I went back to my own twisting stairwell, I found a fulfillment that I had not expected. Now I have to mount my staircase alone. And as I go up step by step, I am turning again, round and round, apparently covering little ground, but climbing upward, and I hope toward the light. One of our great forerunners here at Union, Robert McAfee Brown, said, we read biography and autobiography because we want to learn about ourselves. And I hope that many of you have come here tonight because you want to learn from Karen's experience more about your own spiritual journey. So, Karen Armstrong, The Spiral Staircase, My Climb Out of Darkness.
Thank you, Dean. It's a great privilege to be here in this great and important seminary, and a great privilege. I'm so grateful for this warm welcome. I entered my convent when I was 17 years old, and I was so excited. I really felt that I was going to start a wonderful new spiritual quest, that I was going to find God. I was going to lose myself, or lose all the adolescent confusion and muddle, and become, almost instantly, of course, wise, serene, Buddha-like, inspired and inspiring, perhaps even a saint. Well, that didn't happen. And I left about 7 years later, in 1969, obscurely broken and damaged. And these dark years are where this biography begins. I hadn't found God in this convent, and this was not anybody's fault. I'd been far too young to embark on such a life that demands tremendous maturity. And I was not the right kind of person for that kind of life. I called my first book Through the Narrow Gate because Jesus goes on to say only a few people find the narrow gate. And I was not one of those few. I did meet nuns in my religious order who were mature, whole, kind, compassionate people. But I knew that I wasn't going to be like that. And so, with great sorrow and sadness, I left, and everybody was immensely kind to me when I left. That was hard, because in a sense it would have been so much easier to have flounced out in a state of righteous indignation. But we were all sorry, and I came out to a strange world. Now, why hadn't I found God? Well, for one thing, I had found it in the convent, to my huge disappointment and secret shame, almost impossible to pray. Every single morning I went into that convent chapel to make a meditation. We practiced the discipline of meditation taught by St. Ignatius Loyola in his spiritual exercises. And all I can say it was not for me. I have no problem concentrating normally. I can sit in front of a book for hours at a time and not even notice the minutes passing. But when I could not keep my mind on God for more than 2 minutes, immediately it either went skittering off down a series of self-indulgent byways, fantasies, distractions, or else sunk in a sort of torpor of gloom, boredom, or even sleep. I was an adolescent and didn't like getting up so early in the morning, and throughout the day, too, we had periods of mental prayer, and the heavens remained closed. Now, I don't know what I thought should be happening. I certainly didn't expect visions or voices or anything of that sort. But I felt I should have some kind of encounter, and at least I should be able to keep my mind on God. But nothing like that happened. I seemed almost allergic, antipathetic to God. And I would say to my superiors, look, I'm just failing at this. I cannot do it. And they replied, oh, nonsense, sister, you're exaggerating as usual. Everybody has an off day. But I'd love, as I say, to have had an off day, because that would have meant that some of my days were on. Now, you can appreciate that this inability to pray was, to put it mildly, something of a drawback for a nun. But I carried around this as a secret cause of shame. It touched everything, because a nun's commitment must be measured by the quality of her prayer. And I began to wonder, whether there actually was a God. Maybe it was like the emperor's new clothes. Maybe none of us could keep our minds on our prayers. Maybe none of us encountered the divine. But everybody was too afraid to say so. And I found myself wondering, perhaps there isn't a God. How do we know that God existed, or that Jesus was divine? How do we know all this? And then I'd think, well, how can God possibly reveal himself to a nun who harbors these shameful doubts? And so on I went. And when I finally left the religious life, I struggled on in the Catholic Church for a while. And the Dominicans kept me in longer than I might have been while I was at Oxford University. But then, when I got to London, I just gave it all up without any great fanfare. I just felt simply exhausted by religion. And for about 13, 14 years, I wanted nothing to do with it and thought I'd finished with God. But I'd come out to a very strange world, because I had, my period inside, as it were, coincided almost exactly with the immense social and cultural revolution of the 1960s. And we were completely isolated from any of this. When I came out in 1969, I'd never heard of Vietnam. I'd never heard of President Nixon. They did tell us shortly after I entered about the Cuban Missile Crisis. They felt they should, because the world was about to explode in a nuclear war. And they told us to pray, but they forgot to tell us that the crisis was over. So for about 3 weeks more, we scanned the horizon for mushroom clouds, looking and searching for, and eventually one of us plucked up the courage against all the rules to ask what had happened about Cuba. And they said, "Oh, Lord, we forgot to tell you that it's all out." So you can see how isolated I was. And then I confront this world of the 1960s, utterly transformed. Before I entered, young people had been miniature copies of their parents, wearing neat, sedate clothes, polite, submissive, respectful by and large, or at least allowed themselves to be bossed and ordered around. No longer. And the young people girls were wearing skirts up to their thighs, long flowing hair on the men, and above all, they were confident. And they were protesting. They were always protesting about something, about the establishment, the system, the tyranny of the Oxford Dons. And I thought to myself, heavens, they should try the convent. These kids don't know what tyranny was, the mild, laissez-faire sort of spirit of my Oxford College seemed paradise to me. But then I remembered my last year in the convent, when I had been the one protesting against a system that I believed I had outgrown its day. I was one of the last people to go through the old system that was reformed by the Second Vatican Council. And a lot of customs had congealed over the years, and they were trying to turn us into Victorian ladies who kept their eyes down, kept their voice quiet, never ran upstairs, and above all, were utterly submissive. And here, I know, that here in this great hall of religious learning, I want to stress how important it is to allow young people to be able to think, to express their doubts, and not to tell themselves that black is white and white is black. There was one very revealing moment that happened just a few weeks after I entered, when I just turned 18. And I was being put in for a little ladylike theological diploma specially crafted for nuns, with a lot of the challenging stuff left out, which started with apologetics, the rational grounds for belief. And I was set an essay entitled "Assess the Historical Evidence for the Resurrection." Well, I knew what I had to do. The textbooks were there, I was told exactly what pages to read, and I produced an essay showing that the historicity of the resurrection was about as unproblematic as the Battle of Waterloo, but with a sort of sinking feeling that I really couldn't go along with all this. I just didn't see it working out. So the very nice nun who was teaching us gave my essay back and said, "This is very good, sister, you'll do well in the exam." And I said, "But mother, it isn't true, is it?" And she looked at me and gave a kind of moan, and inserted her hand under our tight headdress, rubbed her forehead, and sighed and said, "No, sister, it isn't true, but don't tell the others." Now, this was part of a program. We were told that at first we were turning our back on worldly ways and worldly ways of thinking. We had to adopt God's ways of thought, which were very different, and accept our superiors in the place of God. When we spoke to our superiors, we knelt down to remind ourselves that they were God's representatives, not just an ordinary human being. And we were told that at the beginning, we would be in some of the things we had to do would seem ridiculous to us, but that was because we were still imbued with the world. And as we gained spiritual maturity, we would find sense in all this. Now, I can see a certain value to this. You know, I think it's important to realize, especially when you're young, that you don't know much, and that you've got to learn, and that and to surrender to something. But if you make a habit of pussyfooting around difficult articles of faith and telling yourself that white was black and black was white, you can damage your mind. For one example, I was once told by my postulant mistress to practice machining at a machine that didn't have a needle. And this, admittedly, this was the result of a misunderstanding. She thought I'd answered her back and said, "There's no needle in that machine." And she said, "You'll sit there and do it." But then, rather like the Cuba crisis, she forgot to tell me that I could stop doing this. And for 2 weeks, I trundled on. And telling myself, this is the point, that this was the best way I could be spending my time. This was God's way. This was God's way, and it may seem ridiculous and pointless to a mere worldly, secular person, but this was not the way that God saw things. Now, I found that once I had left the religious life and was embarking seriously on my study at Oxford, my mind didn't work anymore as it had. It had got out of the healthy habit of reaching fearlessly for the truth. And one day a tutor sent me an essay saying, just live with this poem for a week and write down your personal reaction to it. And I couldn't do it. I could amass essays that had a whole lot of a sort of patchwork quilt of remarks from various literary critics, but my mind and spirit didn't any longer leap out to meet the poem as it had done before I'd entered the convent. And I couldn't have any ideas of my own. There was a sort of blank where the reaction had been. And it was years before I recovered this. I had, in a sense, damaged my powers of thought. And so it's tremendously important, I think, to be clear when you don't understand, not to make an idol of opinions about the divine, for example, that can only be human, that can only be man-made, and realize that they're only provisional, and that if you can't go along with a particular theory or discipline, as the Buddha said, don't do it. He used to say, even my own teachings, leave them if they don't help you. He used to liken religious doctrine to a raft, telling the story of a traveler who came to a great expanse of water, desperately needed to get across, but there was no bridge, no ferry, so he cobbled together a raft and paddled himself across. But then the Buddha said, what's he supposed to do with the raft now? Is he supposed to say, this raft has saved my life and have been immense historical importance in my life, so clearly I must load it onto my back and lug it around with me for the rest of my days? Or should he simply moor it, let it go, and continue his journey? And the answer is obvious, and the Buddha said, that's how you should take religious teachings, monk. If they don't work for you, don't do it. Wait, listen to your inner self. Now, I had other difficulties. For about 6 or 7 years, I existed in a state of grief. Leaving a convent was not like leaving a teacher's training college. You weren't learning a skill that left your inner self intact. This was a conditioning that was meant to last a lifetime, and it did. And once I'd gone outside into a world that I'd been trained to reject at a profound level, I found I simply didn't know how to live. And this was very common. I was at the head of a massive exodus of nuns who left during the 1970s. And after a while, they realized that this was a real problem, that people were disoriented, almost needing the kind of debriefing that people have after they've been in a cult or something of that sort. they needing help to sort of unlearn what they'd learnt in the convent. But there was nothing like that available for me, so I stumbled on. I became anorexic. I became suicidal, not because I particularly wanted to die, but I just didn't know how to live. I'd seemed to have lost the art, lost the knack of living. And I had another problem. I had undiagnosed temporal lobe epilepsy. In the convent, I'd had occasional fainting attacks where I'd suddenly pass out for a few minutes, and I was told to pull myself together. This was sheer hysteria and attention grabbing. And I remember thinking to myself, well, my our subconscious must be extremely slow on the uptake. You'd think by now it would have realized that this fainting does not attract the sympathy and concern that I wanted, but only a sort of cold rebuke. But as on I went with the fainting. After I left the religious life, I started experiencing moments of absolute terror, dread. It's the sort of thing that people often have when they're dying, because their brain is in turmoil. Or I'd go out to a place and find myself somewhere completely different. Or I'd be outside and the world would suddenly crack open and I wouldn't recognize my surroundings. Everything looked strange, sinister, menacing, sinister. And then suddenly everything would plop back into place. Well, I thought I was going mad. I thought that I had rejected the world and I was absolutely unable to live in it now. It was tearing me apart. And I went to doctors who sent me to psychiatrists and talked about my entirely unexceptional childhood. And nothing worked, nothing touched this. Then came a moment, I'd reached really rock bottom. I really, we're talking about 1973, 4 years after leaving the convent, no hope. Eventually the thing was diagnosed as epilepsy of the temporal lobe. It comes from brain damage that I probably received at birth. There's a lesion on the brain. But that was still not forthcoming. And I thought to myself, I'd really reached the end of the road. I'd tried. I had been reaching out for help. I'd hoped for someone to help me. I mean, in a sense, I wasn't really anorexic, because I know anorexia you don't get over easily. I just started eating again, no problem, because I realized that I wasn't going to get any help from outside, that this treatment wasn't touching what ailed me, and there was going to be no help. So stop hoping to get help. Stay with what you've got. You've got to learn to ride these moments out as though you're on a roller coaster. You can't get off, but you know ultimately this horrible ride will come to an end. Just go with it. It was kind of a moment of surrender. And then I went to a lecture by Professor Dame Helen Gardner, Merton Professor of English Literature at Oxford. And she was lecturing on T.S. Eliot at the poem Ash Wednesday, and read aloud to us the first poem of Ash Wednesday, which is, as it were, the spine of my book, and has been of immense importance to me on my journey. It begins, if I can remember it, because I do not hope to turn again, because I do not hope. Because I do not hope to turn again, desiring this man's gift and that man's scope. I no longer strive towards these things. Why should the aged eagle stretch its wings? Why should I mourn the vanished power of the usual rain? And I instantly started to sit up, almost the hairs on the back of my head raised, and I felt myself for the first time in years rising spontaneously to meet the poem, feeling it going right the way through to my very being, because it seemed to express my own moment. I had decided I didn't hope anymore. But the important thing was not that I'd just given up hope, was what Eliot says halfway through. He says, I renounce the blessed face. I renounced the voice, and I'd given up God by this time, who seemed entirely uninterested in me. I renounced the blessed face. I renounced the voice. And because I do not hope to turn again, consequently I rejoice, having to construct something upon which to rejoice. And the awkwardness of the syntax there, the awkwardness of the phrasing, reminds you of that this is an awkward, difficult thing you're going to do. But now my project was that, okay, I had been dealt this bad card. I seem to be losing my mind. This was a bummer. But I still had a lot going for me. After all, I was still leading an extremely privileged life. I was studying at one of the best universities in the world. I had a certain amount of intelligence and talent. Things could be worse. And now my project was to construct my own joy. Because I do not hope to turn again, don't wait for help to come from outside. Consequently, I rejoice. And I would construct my own happiness now with as much care as an aeronautical expert constructs an aeroplane, or an engineer constructs a computer. With that kind of precision, this would be my life's work. And things did start to look up at that point. I'd reached absolute bottom. But things on the outward path continued to go wrong. I'd wanted to be an academic. I'd wanted to teach English literature in a university, but I failed my PhD at Oxford. And I not only failed the thing, but I failed with hideous publicity, and there was a huge scandal about it. I couldn't even seem to fail normally. And there was a 5-month period when they tried to decide what on earth to do with me. They felt there had been irregularities in the examination process. But they eventually decided that because of the sanctity of the Oxford doctorate, my thesis couldn't be re-examined. So that was the end of my academic life. And then I had to go into school teaching. Then I got into school teaching, and I didn't like it much, but at least it was a job. And I got, into things, and I had a little flat, and all was great. But I lost my teaching job after 6 years because of my bad health. By this time, the epilepsy had been diagnosed, but it took a while for the medication to find exactly the right kind of medication for me, and I was missing too much school time. I could see the point. They were good to me. They let me stay far longer than a lot of people would have done. So I left teaching. And what on earth was I going to do now? I had written my first book, Through the Narrow Gate, by this time. And then, because someone saw me on TV, in the new television channel, Channel 4, which was just opening up, because we're talking about 1982, 83, I got invited into television. So I took up for a few years a television career. And I said this to Bill Moyers a few days ago, and he said, "Oh, we take anybody." So I started in TV, and because this is London, you have to understand, secular, sceptical London. The commissioning editor for religion at Channel 4 loathed religion and wanted to subject it to exactly the same kind of critical scrutiny as any other discipline. One of his programs was going to be called Jesus the Evidence, which was going to start by actually blowing up a life-size statue of Jesus at the beginning of the program. "Blast it to smithereens, darling," he said. That'll show the bastards. And he kept on saying, "Darling, these people are all bonkers. They're all mad, darling, believing this rubbish." So I was delighted to go along with this because I'd had enough of religion myself, and I was invited to do a 6-part documentary series on St. Paul. And I thought to myself, right, this is my chance to nail St. Paul, whom I'd always regarded as responsible for much of the ills of Christianity. And I fell into the mine of New Testament scholarship. and you have to understand that I virtually knew nothing. I'd done this little baby diploma in the convent, and it had been a useful introduction. But all my studies had been in English literature since this time, so I was learning on the job. But television is a superficial medium, and I had a wonderful advisor to help me, Michael Golder, and he's a fine New Testament scholar, and he was very tough with me. And I'm so grateful to him, because he taught me the importance and rewarding nature of accuracy in theological discussion. And I found that actually, when faced with the text, of course, I didn't hate St. Paul at all. And of course, I found out that a lot of the most difficult texts were not actually written by him. And following in his footsteps, as I was, going round the site, speaking where he had perhaps been, I found myself becoming closely moved and drawn to this difficult, pugnacious apostle. But most important, I was making this film in Jerusalem with an Israeli film company. It was a peculiar, no one else would have touched this with a barge pole, because we had no money, absolutely no money. There was no teleprompter, and everything had to be one take only. I was totally inexperienced in television, and at the end of the, and it was pretty hard hitting about the nature of what Christianity had become. At the end of it, the Israeli director said, "This is a religious program in only one respect. It is a miracle." And indeed it was a miracle that we'd actually got together a product. I found, and I was, and yet, even though I thought I'd proved conclusively that Paul was the first Christian, that's what we call the series, the first Christian, not Jesus, and that the historical roots of Christianity were very shaky, people wrote to me and said, "Thank you for this. Now I feel I can go back to church." What? Hello? I thought I had proved conclusively that there was nothing in this, that it really was bonkers, as John had thought. But obviously I hadn't. There must have been something in that, and probably my feeling of being moved by Paul. But I was learning important things. I was discovering the other Abrahamic traditions. And I realized in Jerusalem how extremely parochial my religious life had been hitherto, entirely Catholic indeed, not even, Christian, entirely Catholic. And I realized I'd never thought of Judaism as anything except as a kind of prelude to Christianity. And I'd never thought about Islam at all. But in Jerusalem, you can't help noticing these faiths, and I began to see the profound connection between these religions of Abraham, and as well as the differences between them. And from that moment, I started to study the other traditions, and began to find there, and also in Greek Orthodox Christianity, a whole lot of elements in religion that had never occurred to me before, that were entirely new. So it was the study of these other faiths which actually brought me back to a better understanding of what my own faith had been trying to do at its best. But it was a long and slow process. One of the things I learned in Judaism was that early on I had the very good fortune to have a conversation with Chaim Maccabee, who teaches at the Leo Beck College, where I would later become a part-time teacher. And he told me the story of Rabbi Hillel, the elder contemporary of Jesus, who was approached by a group of pagans who promised him that they would convert to Judaism if he could sum up the whole of the Torah while he stood on one leg. And Hillel stood on one leg and said, "Do not do unto others as you would not have done unto you. That is the Torah. The rest is commentary. Go and learn it." And I said, well, that's all very nice, but how could he say this was the essence of Judaism? What were these pagans supposed to believe? And Chaim said to me, easy to see you were brought up Christian. He said, in Judaism, nobody can tell us what to do. There isn't orthodoxy. Theology is poetry, an attempt to express the inexpressible. Religion is about doing things. doing things that change you. It's not about believing creeds. Now that was an entirely new idea for me. I'd struggled for years with doctrines and believing things and struggles to believe, and now, and it was something I couldn't quite take in at first, but I became convinced over the years as my studies continued that Hillel was right. That sounds very arrogant of me, but Hillel expressed it beautifully. Confucius had uttered a version of the Golden Rule himself 500 years before. The Buddha had taught it. Jesus taught a version of the Golden Rule. This is the essence of religion. I'll come to that in a minute. In Islam, I love the pluralism of the Quran and of some of the early Sufis. I love the fact that Sufis would cry aloud in ecstasy, that when they glimpsed the divine, they were neither Jews, Christians, Muslims. They were at home equally in a synagogue, a mosque, a temple, or a church. Because when human beings glimpse what we call God, then these man-made distinctions fade away and become unimportant. Now, all this again was new to me, entirely new. And so things were beginning to move, but I was still very skeptical, and my early books show that skepticism. And working in television, there's no time for these truths to sink in. It's all very much quick fire, hand to mouth, and above all, to be clever. I was up there in front of the camera, and an entertaining, clever guide, sniping at this, debunking that, with being cheered on by the crew and production team. But then I lost my television career, which went down the drain. Yet another failure. I was even ejected from TV. But there was a kind of scandal, not any of my doing, but the film I've been making on the Crusades finished up in a lawyer's office pending inquiries for fraud. So, and I was tarred by this scandal. So there I was, in my funny little house, which was all I could afford because this television didn't bring in much money, in a remote part of London. And one day, as I was toiling up the street, an idea seemed to come to me out of the blue. And if I were religious in a conventional way, I would say it might have been a moment of inspiration. I thought to myself, well, I've got to have a new project, I've got to write something. Though it seemed very doubtful that I'd be able to make a living out of writing alone. But the study of the Crusades has been extremely depressing, all this hatred and hostility between the three Abrahamic religions. Why not write about something that unites them? Why not explore something that they've got in common? What about God? And I decided then I'd write my book, A History of God. And I expected this book to follow the somewhat skeptical debunking cast of its predecessors. I expected that I would show how each age refashioned God in its own image according to its own needs, just manipulated the theology to suit itself. But there was a difference this time. And it's a complex process, but I'll just highlight two important ingredients. Number one is that I was living in silence. When I've been working in TV, we'd constantly having production meetings, chitter-chatter, and it was easy to take a text and say to, your once skeptical colleagues in secular London, look at this is loony, and they would say, bonkers, darling, but there was no one to say that to now. I was alone, and sometimes working alone like this in my remote little house, days would go by sometimes when I'd speak only to passing tradesmen or people in shops. And at first I very much resented this. I was full of anger and rage that these wretched people had landed me in this limbo and messed up my TV career, and that I was now out on a limb. I felt I was completely out on a limb there. But gradually the silence took on a different quality. And of course, silence is a key element in the monastic life. And we practiced silence in the convent, of course, but it had often been full of anxiety. You know, I was nearly always in trouble about something, or I was worried about something, or there was a sort of bad atmosphere, or I was doing needlework, which I couldn't do, and it was just all upset. But this was a difference. There was just me, nothing between me and the text. And theology, I remembered what Chaim said, theology is a kind of poetry. We should take as much trouble with our theological statements as if we were writing a great poem. And our rituals should be constructed with the same kind of care as if we were putting on a play in Broadway. Not just mindlessly chanted, either as a slogan or as a sort of glib statement of orthodoxy which hasn't been thought out. It should lead us, as the Greek Orthodox says, to a moment of absolute silence. You know, like as at the end of a symphony, when the last notes die away and before the applause breaks out, there's that beat of silence when you know there's nothing to be said. And I started to find in this silence, I was having to enter into my own world. And the silence was becoming a musical accompaniment to the text, as it were. And I was beginning to respond to the texts in an entirely different way. They were going in and were changing. Second, I was lucky to find very early in my studies, when I was reading a monumental 3-volume work on the history of Islam, a wonderful book, Marshall G.S. Hodgson's Venture of Islam, there was a footnote in volume 1. And as a diligent student, I always read my footnotes, and I'm very glad I did. Because Hodgson he was explaining in this chapter about mystical, esoteric Islamic thought. And he was saying, the historian of religion cannot approach this kind of spirituality from the vantage point of post-Enlightenment rationalism, in a kind of superior way. Look, these poor yokels didn't understand the importance of reason. You've got to divest yourself of your preconceptions and practice what he called the science of compassion. Now, what he meant by that, of course, scientia, doesn't mean science in the sense of a laboratory or physics or chemistry. It's a way of knowledge, scientia, knowledge. A knowledge based on compassion, which doesn't mean, of course, feeling sorry for people, but it means to feel with. And he said the historian of religion must not leave any text, any idea, any spirituality, until he has come to the point where he can imagine himself feeling the same. He has to keep asking himself, but why? But why? But why? And constructing in a scholarly way the context that made this possible. And until he feels some answering resonance, real answering resonance in his being. Otherwise, you'll just remain glibly on the purely rational surface of things. And so I copied this out, and I found it helpful, because when I was writing about somebody like Muhammad, for example, I had, even though I didn't believe in a God myself any longer, a personal God who spoke, nevertheless, I was having to enter the mind of Muhammad, a man who believed that he had been touched by this God. And unless I could somehow, I'd enter into that experience, see to some degree what it had meant to him, I would miss the essence of Muhammad. Now, this is important, I think, for 2 reasons. A, remember the golden rule, the essence of religion. I came in my studies to realize, especially with my study of the Buddha, that the religious life, the essence of the religious life, is not doctrines or beliefs, it's the practice of compassion. We seek ecstasy in our lives. And Ecstasy doesn't necessarily mean going off into a trance or a vision. Ekstasis means to go beyond the self, to stand outside the self. And when you enter the mind of another, you put yourself behind. And compassion is one of the best ways of dethroning yourself from the center of your world and putting another there. And this, I found, over time was beginning to change me. And funnily enough, now that I was able to relate to other people's feelings, I began to experience a real joy. And there were moments in my study when I would occasionally feel touched by some form of awe or wonder or delight. Now, my colleagues at the Leo Beck College laugh at me and tell me that that's a very Jewish spirituality, that this is what Jews do when they study Torah and Talmud. They immerse themselves in the text, feel touched within and lifted momentarily beyond themselves. And St. Benedict used to make his monks practice a discipline that he called Lectio Divina, divine study, whereby you read that your texts, your scripture, your fathers of the church, and in the course of it you might experience milliseconds of what Benedict called oratio, or prayer. And this was I realized my work was becoming a kind of meditation, the kind of meditation that I'd been unable to do in the convent, but this was what had happened. I'm just checking up on the time here. So I'm now going to draw my remarks to an end. I call my book The Spiral Staircase because, for a number of reasons. First, because that poem, Ash Wednesday, has been so important in my journey. And it depicts in some of its poems the poet climbing a spiral staircase. And even the verse twists around upon itself like a spiral staircase, repeating the same phrases, apparently going round in circles, apparently making little progress, but nevertheless advancing steadily from one insight to another. And in most mythological systems, a staircase, like a ladder, is often a symbol of a change of consciousness. And I would now describe myself a religious person. I used to call myself a freelance monotheist because I drew nourishment from all three of the monotheistic religions. And could see none of them as superior to the others. I was nourished by all three. But now that's not really accurate, because not only have I written about the Buddha, I'm now engaged in a study of the Hindu tradition and the Chinese, who have wonderful insights. And they are not theists in our sense. So, but yes, I'm a religious person. You could even say that I'm a convalescent, as it were. I'm in recovery, and study is my kind of therapy, bringing me back to a sense of religion and the sacred, and being taught the disciplines of ecstasis and compassion in my study. I love my work. I cannot wait to get up in the morning. I'm wandering round and I have to do boring things like drying my hair, and I keep sneaking up to the study and having a little peek as to see what I'm going to be reading that day. And I just love it. I feel so privileged. But I also sometimes smile to myself, because in a sense, what am I? I'm still a kind of nun after all these years. I'm never married. I live alone, in silence for most of the time when I'm not on tour, and spending my days writing, thinking, speaking about God, religion, and spirituality. And Rosemary read out my last conclusions, where I seem to keep on thinking of Eliot's spiral staircase. And much of my life has been so repetitive. I kept making stupid mistakes. People kept telling me, you're not really suited for the academic life. And I wasn't, not really. And thank goodness I did fail that thesis. I wouldn't be here tonight. I wouldn't have been on the same journey. Sometimes it's not a bad thing to fail. It just nudges you into a different mode, into a different perception. But I keep making the same mistakes, the same disasters, round and round and round. And yet all the time, I was changing. And so here I am in front of you, a seeker, a nun on the spiral staircase, reaching out with my readers towards the light. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Karen, for sharing your spiritual quest with us and for helping us to, I hope, come to greater discernment of our own spiritual quest.
Thank you.
We want to give a little bit of time now for you to ask questions or make any comments that you might like to, and Karen asked me to field those. We have this problem in this room about hearing, and so we do need to ask you, if you have a question, to please come forward and speak from this microphone here in the middle, or certainly you're welcome to come here too. But please come to a microphone and ask your question or make your comment, and we'll take a little while to let Karen respond directly to you. So don't be bashful now. Thank you.
You just mentioned in your concluding statement that you're going towards the light. Could you comment on what that light is?
I certainly can't define it, because one of the things I've learned is that what is holy and what is sacred is indefinable. That was one of the things I learned when I was researching my book about God. That all the great traditions insist that you cannot define God or say exactly what it is. I'm not so concerned about the end. I'm not concerned about, what happens at the end when I get to the top of the spiral staircase. I get glimpses of this light in my study, or when I glimpse the holiness of the world. There was I believe this world is what we have. But what we've got to do is learn to see the holiness that is there and that is in every one of us and is in our environment. There's a wonderful passage in the Upanishads whereby a young man who comes back from his training as a Brahmin, full of himself, and his father wants to teach him a lesson about Brahman, God, what we call the ultimate reality, or God. And he fills a beaker full of with a lump of salt, and in the morning the salt has dissolved. And he sips it, the son, and finds that salt has pervaded the beaker, even though he can't see it. And he says, "This is Brahman. You can't see it, but it's there, and it's in you, Svetaketu." It's a very important moment, and our job is to learn to look for the light of holiness in the unpromising surroundings that we have. And I think you can only do that by the discipline of compassion, leaving yourself aside and opening yourself to the other. Hindus have a practice of bowing when they encounter one another, because they're encountering worshipping the divinity that they're meeting in that other human being. And I think I'll finish, just quickly. The light, I don't see it as God saying hi, at the end. It's not. But I suppose enlightenment is what I'd like. The Buddha is one of my favorite people. And he would say it's not important to know what happens at the end, but you'll get a peace. I suppose what I'm talking about is the realm of sacred peace at the center of yourself, so that you can live in the pain of this world somehow at peace and still and quiet. That's what I'm hoping for. That's enlightenment. I'm a long way off. I get glimpses of that. I get glimpses of it in other people, and in the wonderful writings that I'm studying. But I've not yet met that light. And of course, if I knew what it was, that wouldn't be a light, the light at all, because it would be just a bright idea of my own.
Yes.
Thank you for a great talk, very fresh and insightful and generous. I wanted to ask you a question because this may be the only opportunity after everyone's going to want to talk to you about something. Have you read a book that made a great impression on me, and perhaps you haven't read it? It was written by an ex-Jesuit named Jack Miles called God, a Biography.
Yes, I did read it. But I don't. It was more of an exercise in literary criticism, I think, and I enjoyed it. I thought it was brilliantly clever, and Jack and I are in contact with one another and sharing our insight, and that's one way to do it. For me, the literary approach, it's not for me because it smacks too much of my Eng-lit background. And I still approach English literature as a slightly competitive scholar. I sort of fell into that habit. But it's a great book and very thought-provoking. Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, thank you. You said at the end of your talk, you spoke about your experience with the three major monotheistic religions and how as you say, I think you said find none superior to the other, and now you've gone on to other religions. I just finished a film called Hiding and Seeking, which is about an Orthodox Jewish man who is troubled by his sons, who are very religious, deeply Orthodox Jews studying in Jerusalem, and their inability to see the broader world, and the father says what you say, but at the same time struggles with that dilemma that it seems as if we live in a world where many people who are deeply religious appreciate their own religion very much, but don't find the wisdom you do in other religions. And I'm just wondering if you think it's possible for religious people to reconcile other traditions as deeply as you have.
I think it's essential now. You see, I don't think interfaith, since September the 11th, changed our world. Thank you. It's a very good and important question. Since September the 11th changed our world, I think this kind of appreciation and learning isn't just a luxury or a nice thing to do. It's essential for our survival. But the problem is great. Now, I don't recommend everybody to follow my freelance monotheist or whatever it is path. That's because I've had a rather peculiar religious journey. And as I say, I'm convalescent. I have no idea where I'll end up. Who knows? I mean, Said Hussein Nas, the distinguished Islamic scholar, is often saying to me, Miss Armstrong, it's time you settle down and stopped all this sort of cruising around the religions. And he may have a point. But for me at the moment, I'm on this quest. But I think the important thing is to root yourself, if you can, in your own tradition. Explore its riches to the full. Stick with it. Go with it, but learn to look out at other people. And you know, in a sense, that is happening in a way. It's been happening in a way for a long time, because we do live in a plural world, whether we like it or not. We're living cheek by jowl with people of other faiths. And for example, more Christians read Martin Buber than Jews. And Jews read Paul Tillich and Harvey Cox. Jesuits are learning meditation from Buddhist monks. People are calling themselves Jewish Buddhists or Christian Buddhists. And people are beginning to reach out and reaching out quite spontaneously, without any great fanfare, to other faiths. picking up Sufi, Rumi, for example, very popular in the West, and quite rightly too, a wonderful mystic and poet. So I think that is happening, but we are living in a frightening world. We're living in a global village. I am excited by the opportunities of pluralism. The discovery in the 20th century of the faith that lies at the root of the other traditions has revolutionized our worldview, so we can never look at either our own faith or other people's faith in the same way again. And I find that thrilling, and you've seen, for me, the study of other religions redeemed me religiously. It, as it were, saved me. But other people find this very threatening. And we have to understand it's no good dragooning people and saying, you've got to be tolerant, because that's a contradiction in terms. I'd like those of us who are inclined to the plural, larger view, to drop the word toleration, which I find awfully grudging, really, as though we're putting up with people, and go for appreciation. It doesn't mean that that we're being asked to give up our own tradition, but learn, get a few tips from other people. How have you done this? How have you avoided this pitfall? What can we learn from this mysticism? You see, I think in the monotheistic world we have a huge amount to learn from the Buddha, for example, in his, with his emphasis on practice and on compassion. So I would commend this pluralistic study. It is happening, but other people are frightened and are retreating into denominational ghettos where they're erecting new barricades against the other. It's about identity. Now, we use religion to give ourselves a sense of identity, but identity can't become the be-all and end-all of the religious quest, because otherwise we just get ego blown up. As Heschel, Rabbi Joshua Heschel said, when we put ourselves at the opposite pole of ego, we're in the place where God is. But when people are frightened, they do retreat. And we've got to realize the fear that lies at the heart of so much of the intransigence that we are seeing around us today, and try to assuage those, somehow, I don't know how, those fears and anxieties.
We have two more people bringing us questions, and I'm going to honor those questions before we go into our reception. So come forward, Jennifer.
Hi, I just wanted to thank you for coming to Union. My name's Jennifer. I'm a student here at Union, and it was lovely having you. And I've been reading so much about prayer lately for my thesis, and I was wondering, you started off talking about your prayer life, and I was wondering how that's come full circle now with this book and the other.
Thank you. Prayer, I still to this day cannot meditate. To this day, if you know, the thought of it makes me feel uneasy and scared and frightened and depressed because of those awful hours of failure at the beginning. But my prayer is my study, and and this is a great thing. I think too that prayer is for us. I think it helps us to use language in a different way that helps to break down the ego, even when we're singing or praising. How often in life do we actually wholeheartedly praise somebody? You know, because we're so concerned with ego and survival that we'll say things like, "Oh, tremendous!" Of course, you say, "Well, you know," and of course, and then we make a little drawback. As people used to say to me, often do say to me, things like, "Congratulations on your fabulous reviews. You put on weight recently," or something, just to sort of prick that bubble. Or else there's, you know, or apology. How often do we say, "I am sorry," because our egos don't let us. We say, "I'm really sorry about that." But on the other hand, you did say X, Y, and Z, or, you know, it's partly your fault too. And prayer teaches us a different way of using language that leaves that frightened ego protection behind, so that we praise without reserve, express our sorrow without reserve, express our thanks without reserve. And that can teach us to lay a new way of thinking and to lay aside the clamorous little ego that always wants to defend and inflate itself. And that ego keeps us from the divine.
Jill.
Thank you very much for being here. I'm sure you are aware that both of the Professor Ulanoffs are and was psychiatry and religion professors. I wonder if, in all of your journeys and thinking back on, and you were obviously a very religious young woman, if some of your expectations might have been unrealistic, but have you found, looking back over all of this, any religious meaning, like a sense of the transcendent guiding these struggles and even the sense of madness?
Do I have a sense of transcendence guiding these?
Yeah, or in it somehow.
Yes, I think I've found a sense of transcendence. I wouldn't say guiding it, that's not my way. But I think if you think of the way people have expressed the religious impulse across the board in the world religions, some experience the divine as revelation, as guidance, as something coming from outside. And that's revelation. That's the chief monotheistic mode, if you like, where it's an encounter with something outside ourselves. And a lot of people feel that, and that's absolutely A-OK valid. Other people, like the Buddhists, say it's something you elicit within yourself, that you elicit within yourself by means of your own practice, above all, not thought, or by disciplines such as yoga, etc. So and I'm more of that persuasion, I think. But that's not mean that I am right and other people are wrong, because no one has the last word on God. The test is that if it leads you to practice compassion. So I have glimpsed little transcendence, and I'm learning slowly. But my view is to look for the transcendent in other people. I think if we practice the golden rule day by day, hour by hour, moment by moment, we'd endlessly transcend ourselves. We would endlessly look into our pain, find out what troubles us, refuse to inflict that pain on anybody else. And in that moment, you've gone beyond yourself. And that's my way. And I've got glimpses of that's the way human beings are supposed to be. Other people will experience this differently. Other people will experience guidance. Psychiatry has been difficult for me, largely because of these, I won't call them dumbos exactly, but these psychiatrists who saw me for 3 or 4 years without diagnosing my epilepsy, which apparently is a textbook case, and they're all doctors, and they did leave me floundering in there for a while. But I do think, however, so it's rather kind of ruined for me, and a lot of my friends are psychotherapists, so I'm willing to keep an open mind on all this.
If you think of William James' sick soul, the meaning being found in the religious meaning being found in the struggle and sometimes in the downright pathology.
Yes, I think, but yes, I see your point. I think that we all have struggle. We all experience suffering, and that can be meaningful, or we can turn it in upon ourselves and let it corrode us, the struggle. The struggle can make us turn in. And sometimes it's easy to say, well, you've just got to sort of find meaning in it. When you're really down, it's impossible. You're numbed, you're beaten down. So it is, I think he calls them sick souls because those kind of, William James, because these bursts of light, sudden transcendence can be a little suspect. The Greek Orthodox find it suspect, for example, in that they see it as a slow, steady, incremental change. And that will involve struggle, but not in an egotistic way. I do see mysticism, that psychotherapy can be a modern secular form of mysticism, one by one, with a guru, going down into the depths of the self to find a new strength, a new personality there. Huge convergences between some of the Jewish mystics in particular who in the 12th century are talking about free association and those kind of techniques that would later become psychotherapeutic. So I think that there are all kinds of convergences there, but I'm slightly leery of studying psychology or psychiatry because of my own bad experience with it.
Thank you, Karen. Before any of you leave the room, I want to excuse Karen and Sheila O'Shea, who is with her, from the Alfred Knopf Company, and let them walk down the aisle first and go into the refectory where they will have books that Karen can sign for you, and if we wait and let you go out first, then she'll never get out. So
Karen Armstrong is author of Through the Narrow Gate, Islam and the History of God. Her latest, The Spiral Staircase, is published by Knopf, an imprint of Random House. Visit randomhouse.com/Knopf for more information. Next week on Public Lives, Catherine Clinton's biography of abolitionist Harriet.
Morning, I went into that convent chapel to make a meditation. We practiced the discipline of meditation taught by St. Ignatius Loyola in his spiritual exercises. And all I can say it was not for me. I have no problem concentrating normally. I can sit in front of a book for hours at a time and not even notice the minutes passing. But when I could not keep my mind on God for more than 2 minutes, immediately it either went skittering off down a series of self-indulgent byways, fantasies, distractions, or else sunk in a sort of torpor of gloom, boredom, or even sleep. I was an adolescent and didn't like getting up so early in the morning, and throughout the day, too, we had periods of mental prayer, and the heavens remained closed. Now, I don't know what I thought should be happening. I certainly didn't expect visions or voices or anything of that sort. But I felt I should have some kind of encounter, and at least I should be able to keep my mind on God. But nothing like that happened. I seemed almost allergic, antipathetic to God. And I would say to my superiors, look, I'm just failing at this. I cannot do it. And they replied, oh, nonsense, sister, you're exaggerating as usual. Everybody has an off day. But I'd love, as I say, to have had an off day, because that would have meant that some of my days were on. Now, you can appreciate that this inability to pray was, to put it mildly, something of a drawback for a nun. But
over the last 2 weeks, I have had the very, very meaningful experience of having the opportunity to read The Spiral Staircase, My Climb Out of Darkness. And just to show you how on the front wave of things we are, this book was given to me as a pre-publication date because the book was only published this past Tuesday. So we are here in this very lovely occasion to inaugurate this book with Karen Armstrong and the Knopf Company. And so it's a very special privilege for us. Most of you, I know, over the past decade have read several of Karen Armstrong's studies on Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, in which she is seeking to enlighten us on a multi-faith dialogue and perspective, and demonstrating that we are all seeking the same God. We have these books in the other room, and you'll have the opportunity to purchase them and to purchase The Spiral Staircase, which Karen will autograph for you afterwards. The History of God, biographies of Muhammad and Buddha, Jerusalem, One City and Three Faiths. I'm not going on because she has now written 15 books, and you'll have a chance to browse on them, I think. Tonight, she's going to share with us a more personal spiritual journey, which interweaves her own story with the story of her interfaith journey that she has made. And I want to read to you from the final paragraph of this wonderful new book of hers. She says, I picture a narrow spiral staircase. I
carried around this as a secret cause of shame. It touched everything, because a nun's commitment must be measured by the quality of her prayer. And I began to wonder, whether there actually was a God. Maybe it was like the emperor's new clothes. Maybe none of us could keep our minds on our prayers. Maybe none of us encountered the divine. But everybody was too afraid to say so. And I found myself wondering, perhaps there isn't a God. How do we know that God existed, or that Jesus was divine? How do we know all this? And then I'd think, well, how can God possibly reveal himself to a nun who harbors these shameful doubts? And so on I went. And when I finally left the religious life, I struggled on in the Catholic Church for a while. And the Dominicans kept me in longer than I might have been while I was at Oxford University. But then, when I got to London, I just gave it all up without any great fanfare. I just felt simply exhausted by religion. And for about 13, 14 years, I wanted nothing to do with it and thought I'd finished with God. But I'd come out to a very strange world, because I had, my period inside, as it were, coincided almost exactly with the immense social and cultural revolution of the 1960s. And we were completely isolated from any of this. When I came out in 1969, I'd never heard of Vietnam. I'd never heard of President Nixon. They did tell us shortly after I entered about the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Get off of it and join others on what seemed to me to be a broad, noble flight of steps, thronged with people. But I kept falling off. And when I went back to my own twisting stairwell, I found a fulfillment that I had not expected. Now I have to mount my staircase alone. And as I go up step by step, I am turning again, round and round, apparently covering little ground, but climbing upward, and I hope toward the light. One of our great forerunners here at Union, Robert McAfee Brown, said, "We read biography and autobiography because we want to learn about ourselves." And I hope that many of you have come here tonight because you want to learn from Karen's experience more about your own spiritual journey. So, Karen Armstrong, The Spiral Staircase, My Climb Out of Darkness.
Thank you, Dean. It's a great privilege to be here in this great and important seminary, and a great privilege. I'm so grateful for this warm welcome. I entered my convent when I was 17 years old, and I was so excited. I really felt that I was going to start a wonderful new spiritual quest, that I was going to find God. I was going to lose myself, or lose all the adolescent confusion and muddle, and become, almost instantly, of course, wise, serene, Buddha-like, inspired and inspiring, perhaps even a saint. Well, that didn't happen. And I left about 7 years later, in 1969, obscurely broken and damaged. And these dark years where this biography begins. I hadn't found God in this convent, and this was not anybody's fault. I'd been far too young to embark on such a life that demands tremendous maturity, and I was not the right kind of person for that kind of life. I called my first book Through the Narrow Gate, because Jesus goes on to say only a few people find the narrow gate. And I was not one of those few. I did meet nuns in my religious order who were mature, whole, kind, compassionate people. But I knew that I wasn't going to be like that. And so, with great sorrow and sadness, I left, and everybody was immensely kind to me when I left. That was hard, because in a sense it would have been so much easier to have flounced out in a state of righteous indignation. But we were all sorry, and I came out to a strange world. Now, why hadn't I found God? Well, for one thing, I had found it in the convent, to my huge disappointment and secret shame, almost impossible to pray. Every single